What if I told you that one of the most celebrated holidays in the world carries stories that were edited, rewritten, and conveniently forgotten? What if the Christmas you know is only a version, polished, commercialized, and incomplete? Stay with me, because by the end of this message, you won't just see Christmas different. You'll question why no one ever told you this before. We grow up believing that Christmas is simple, beautiful, harmless, wrapped in lights, love, generosity, and joy. And that's exactly why this conversation is uncomfortable. Because when something feels good, we rarely ask questions. But history doesn't disappear just because it makes us uneasy. It waits, and today we're finally listening. This is not about taking away joy. It's about understanding truth. Because when we understand truth, we celebrate with awareness, not ignorance, and awareness is power. Most people celebrate Christmas without ever asking why certain traditions exist, where they came from, or who decided what version of the story would be passed down. What we call tradition is often a carefully selected narrative, one shaped by politics, culture, power, and convenience. The reason you must listen to this entire message is simple. If you don't understand the origins of what you celebrate, you risk honoring symbols without understanding their meaning. And when meaning is lost, manipulation becomes easy. This is the part nobody dares to talk about. History has never been a neutral storyteller. It has always spoken with the voice of influence, authority, and control. What survives in public memory is rarely the full truth. It is the version that served the interests of those who held power at the time. Celebrations, beliefs, and traditions do not simply spread on their own. They are shaped, refined, and sometimes repackaged to guide societies in a particular direction. Christmas, as it exists today, is no exception to this pattern. When powerful institutions sought unity across diverse cultures, they understood something very important about human psychology. People resist force, but they accept familiarity. Instead of erasing existing customs, they blended them with new narratives. Festivals that were already deeply rooted in communities were not removed, they were rebranded, dates were adjusted, symbols were reinterpreted, meanings were reassigned. Over time, these changes felt natural, even sacred, because repetition has a way of turning strategy into tradition. What most people don't realize is that this process wasn't driven purely by spirituality. It was influenced by politics, geography, and the need to maintain social order. A unified celebration was easier to manage than fragmented beliefs. Shared rituals created shared identity, and shared identity made populations easier to lead. The story that was told was not always the story that existed, but the one that worked. As generations passed, the original context faded. Questions disappeared. Children inherited customs without explanations, and adults repeated them without reflection. Eventually, the edited version became the only version people knew. When history is filtered long enough, it stops feeling like a narrative and starts feeling like absolute truth. And once something is accepted as absolute, challenging it feels rebellious, unnecessary, even offensive, which is exactly how power preserves itself quietly, gracefully, and almost invisibly, through celebration, familiarity, and silence rather than force or fear or resistance. Tradition has a powerful way of disarming curiosity. When something is passed down through generations, it gains emotional authority, even when its origins are unclear or misunderstood. People rarely ask questions about what feels familiar, because familiarity creates comfort, and comfort often replaces truth. Over time, repetition transforms ideas into rituals, and rituals into unquestionable norms. This is how practices survive, not because they are accurate, but because they are inherited. Many customs associated with Christmas were not introduced as sacred truths, but as cultural bridges. They were meant to ease transitions, to make change less visible, less disruptive. Symbols, dates, and practices were chosen not for their divine precision, but for their ability to resonate with existing habits. When something feels recognizable, people accept it more easily, and once accepted, it becomes defended. What begins as adaptation slowly hardens into doctrine. The danger lies not in tradition itself, but in blind loyalty to it. When tradition is treated as untouchable, it becomes immune to examination. Questioning it feels like betrayal, even when the question is sincere. Society teaches us to protect tradition, not to understand it. And in doing so, it often sacrifices honesty for harmony. The moment tradition becomes more important than truth, growth stops. Over centuries, layers were added to Christmas until the original intent became buried beneath ceremony and routine. Each generation received a finished product, not the blueprint. Without context, meaning fades, but practice continues. People celebrate without understanding, defend without knowledge, and pass on habits without awareness. Tradition then becomes a loop, not a lesson. True respect for heritage does not come from unthinking repetition, but from informed choice. When people understand where traditions come from, they gain the freedom to decide how to engage with them. Awareness does not destroy tradition, it gives it depth. But when tradition is allowed to stand in place of truth, it quietly turns belief into habit and faith into performance, preserved not by conviction, but by custom and comfort at some point. Celebration shifted from meaning to measurement. What was once centered on reflection, connection, and shared values slowly became defined by price tags, expectations, and public display. Christmas did not lose its soul overnight. It was diluted gradually, shaped by markets that understood emotion better than most institutions. When feelings are involved, selling becomes easier. Joy became a product. Generosity became a transaction, and the season became an industry. The modern version of Christmas teaches people to equate love with spending and importance with excess. Advertisements tell us what happiness should look like, what a perfect holiday must include, and how much it should cost. Silence and stillness were replaced with noise and urgency. The pressure to participate became heavier than the desire to understand. In this environment, meaning struggles to survive. Commercialization did not simply add to the celebration, it replaced its core. Time once reserved for reflection is now consumed by preparation and consumption. People are encouraged to buy before they think, to compare before they appreciate, to perform before they feel. Even kindness is sometimes measured by visibility rather than sincerity. When generosity needs an audience, it loses its purity. What makes this transformation more powerful is how normalized it feels. From childhood, people are conditioned to associate the season with gifts, decorations, and consumption cycles. By the time they are old enough to question it, the pattern is already emotional, nostalgic, and deeply protected. Challenging it feels like challenging joy itself. When profit becomes the loudest voice in a sacred season, depth becomes inconvenient. Simplicity is seen as lacking, contentment is seen as unambitious, and quiet understanding is drowned out by sales, countdowns, and expectations. The season still looks beautiful, but beneath the surface, its center of gravity has shifted from inward values to outward validation, from shared meaning to shared spending. From purpose to performance, emotional attachment has a quiet power to protect ideas from scrutiny. When something is tied to childhood memories, family gatherings, warmth, and belonging, questioning it feels deeply personal. It can feel like an attack on identity rather than an invitation to understanding. This is why certain conversations never happen, not because the questions are invalid, but because the emotions attached to them are overwhelming. Comfort becomes a shield, and history remains untouched. Christmas occupies a space that feels safe and sacred in the human heart. It is associated with kindness, generosity, and togetherness, which makes any critical examination feel unnecessary or even threatening. People fear that questioning the origins might strip the season of its beauty, but beauty built on unexamined foundations is fragile. It survives on feeling, not on truth, and feelings, while powerful, are not the same as understanding. Society often teaches people to preserve emotional peace rather than pursue intellectual honesty. It is easier to repeat what feels good than to investigate what feels complicated. Discomfort is avoided, even when it carries the potential for growth. Over time, this avoidance becomes collective. Questions are labeled as disruptive. Curiosity is mistaken for negativity. Silence is rewarded with acceptance. This emotional resistance is not accidental. When people are emotionally invested, they are easier to guide and harder to challenge. A tradition that feels comforting does not need to be defended with facts. It is defended with sentiment. Memories replace evidence. Nostalgia replaces context, and the past becomes untouchable, not because it is sacred, but because it is emotionally protected. Yet truth does not destroy comfort, it strengthens it. When people allow themselves to sit with discomfort, even briefly, they gain clarity. They learn to separate what truly matters from what merely feels familiar. Growth begins when emotion and reason are allowed to coexist. Without that balance, celebration becomes routine, belief becomes habit, and history remains buried beneath warmth, smiles, and carefully preserved silence. Silence is rarely empty. More often, it is intentional. Certain conversations are avoided not because they lack importance, but because they threaten stability. When a celebration becomes deeply woven into culture, economy, and identity, questioning it feels risky. Systems that benefit from continuity prefer repetition over reflection. It is safer to preserve a familiar narrative than to invite examination that could unsettle long-standing structures. Over time, Christmas grew beyond a spiritual observance into a social and economic force. Entire industries aligned themselves with the season. Traditions became schedules. Rituals became revenue. When something supports livelihoods, institutions, and national calendars, challenging its foundations becomes inconvenient. Education gives way to preservation. Explanation gives way to performance. What is repeated becomes protected. Another reason these conversations were avoided is fear of division. Leaders often choose unity over truth, believing that shared celebration is more valuable than shared understanding. Asking difficult questions can feel like opening doors to disagreement, doubt, and discomfort. So instead of equipping people with context, societies offered certainty. Instead of teaching complexity, they offered simplicity. Over time, people learned what to celebrate, but not why. There is also the discomfort of admitting that widely accepted narratives may be incomplete. Acknowledging this requires humility, and humility is difficult for institutions built on authority. It is easier to label questions as unnecessary than to revisit history honestly. Silence protects reputation. Silence maintains order. Silence allows traditions to continue uninterrupted. As generations passed, the absence of discussion became normal. People assumed that if something was important, it would have been explained already. The lack of conversation was mistaken for clarity. Curiosity slowly faded. What remained was tradition without context and celebration without examination. When silence persists long enough, it becomes culture, and culture has a powerful way of shaping belief. People stop asking not because they are satisfied, but because they were never taught that asking was allowed. In that quiet space, narratives remain unchallenged, systems remain comfortable, and truth waits patiently beneath layers of familiarity, routine, and unquestioned acceptance. Awareness changes the way people engage with the world. It shifts celebration from automatic behavior to intentional choice. When individuals understand the origins of what they practice, they reclaim agency. They are no longer participating out of habit or pressure, but out of clarity. This is where meaning is restored, not by rejecting everything familiar, but by seeing it clearly. The most valuable gift is not found under a tree or inside a box. It is the ability to think independently, to separate truth from tradition, and intention from imitation. Awareness invites people to ask what truly aligns with their values and what they have simply inherited without reflection. It transforms participation into purpose. Understanding history does not demand the destruction of celebration. It asks for honesty. It allows people to keep what resonates and release what no longer serves them. With awareness, traditions evolve from rigid routines into conscious expressions. Celebration becomes personal again, grounded in values rather than expectations. When people are informed, they are harder to manipulate. They are less influenced by emotional pressure, social comparison, and commercial urgency. Awareness quiets the noise and restores depth. It encourages reflection over performance and sincerity over display. It reminds people that meaning is internal before it is external. This kind of clarity brings freedom. Freedom to celebrate differently. Freedom to define joy on one's own terms. Freedom to resist narratives that no longer align with truth. Awareness does not create distance from others, it creates authenticity within oneself, and authenticity is what gives any celebration lasting power. When awareness becomes part of tradition, the season regains its soul. It moves away from surface-level rituals and returns to intentional values. People begin to celebrate with understanding rather than assumption, with purpose rather than pressure. In this space, celebration is no longer driven by obligation or nostalgia, but by conscious choice, personal conviction, and a deeper connection to truth that honors both history and the present moment.